June 1812. Along the banks of the Niemen River, an enormous army prepared to march east. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers gathered beneath the banners of Napoleon Bonaparte. Frenchmen stood beside Poles, Germans, Italians, Dutchmen, and soldiers from across Napoleon's growing empire. They were part of the Grande Armée, one of the largest military forces Europe had ever seen. They had come to Russia expecting victory. Napoleon had already defeated some of Europe's most powerful armies. He had conquered kingdoms, humbled emperors, and transformed France into the dominant military power on the continent. But this time, Napoleon was marching into a country unlike any he had ever invaded. A country so vast that distance itself could become a weapon. And within months, this magnificent army would be reduced to starving survivors struggling through snow. This is the story of how Russia swallowed Napoleon's army. Napoleon, at the height of his power. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. His armies had defeated Austria. They had crushed Prussia. They had fought Russia and forced Emperor Alexander I into an uneasy agreement. But the alliance between France and Russia was never truly stable. Napoleon's continental system was designed to weaken Britain by preventing European countries from trading with it. Russia increasingly resisted the system. Napoleon believed that pressure alone would not be enough. He decided to force Russia back into submission. And so, he prepared an army unlike anything Europe had seen before. The plan seemed simple. March into Russia. Find the Russian army. Destroy it in one decisive battle. Capture the political center of the empire. And force Alexander to negotiate. It was a strategy that had worked before. But Russia had no intention of playing Napoleon's game. On June 24th, 1812, Napoleon's army crossed the Niemen River. The invasion had begun. The sight was extraordinary. Thousands of cavalrymen, infantry stretching for miles, artillery pieces, supply wagons, horses, engineers, thousands upon thousands of men moving east. For the soldiers, it must have seemed as if nothing could stop them, but the Russian army was already preparing its response. And that response was surprisingly simple. They would retreat. Instead of confronting Napoleon immediately, Russian forces withdrew deeper into their enormous homeland. Napoleon advanced, but the decisive battle never came. The farther he marched, the farther the Russians disappeared. And slowly, the greatest strength of Napoleon's army began turning into its greatest weakness. Napoleon's armies were built around speed. His system of warfare depended on movement, concentration, and the ability to bring supplies forward. But Russia was different. The distances were enormous. Roads were often poor. The supply network struggled to keep pace. And every mile the army marched east increased the distance between the soldiers and their sources of food and ammunition. Thousands of horses began dying. Without horses, cavalry became weaker. Without horses, artillery became difficult to move. Without transportation, supplies could not reach the troops. The army was consuming enormous quantities of food every day. And the deeper Napoleon went into Russia, the harder that food became to find. The Russians understood this. They did not need to destroy Napoleon immediately. They simply needed to make his army continue marching. As Russian forces withdrew, they began destroying what Napoleon needed most. Food stores were emptied. Supplies were removed, villages were abandoned, fields were devastated, and anything that could help the French army was destroyed or taken away. It was a brutal strategy. The Russians were sacrificing their own territory to deny Napoleon the resources necessary to maintain his army. For the French soldiers, the consequences were immediate. They entered villages expecting food. Instead, they found empty buildings. They searched for grain. There was little left. The countryside itself seemed to be disappearing before them. Napoleon was advancing through Russia, but Russia was denying him the ability to live off the land. The invasion was slowly becoming a race between Napoleon's army and its own supply system. In August, Napoleon finally reached Smolensk. The city represented a major objective. After weeks of marching, the army desperately needed supplies, shelter, and rest. But once again, the Russians refused to give Napoleon the decisive victory he wanted. They withdrew, and parts of Smolensk were left burning. Napoleon had captured the city, but the victory felt strangely empty. The Russian army had survived. The French had suffered losses. Supplies were still a problem, and Moscow was still hundreds of kilometers away. Napoleon now faced a crucial decision. Should he stop, or should he continue east? He chose to continue, and the road to Moscow became the road to catastrophe. September 7th, 1812. Near the village of Borodino, the Russian army finally decided to stand and fight. Napoleon had spent weeks trying to force this moment. Now he had it. The battle that followed was one of the bloodiest of the entire Napoleonic Wars. French infantry attacked Russian positions. Russian artillery fired into advancing formations. Cavalry charged across the battlefield. The fighting continued for hours. Men fell by the thousands. The battlefield became a landscape of smoke, blood, and shattered formations. By the end of the day, Napoleon could claim victory, but it was a terrible victory. The Russian army had not been destroyed. It withdrew. Napoleon had lost enormous numbers of men, and the army that remained was already exhausted. Yet Moscow was now within reach. Napoleon believed that capturing the city would finally force Russia to surrender. He marched on. On September 14th, Napoleon entered Moscow. For a moment, it appeared that the campaign had reached its climax. The French emperor had captured the ancient Russian city. But something was wrong. Moscow was largely deserted. The Russian authorities had withdrawn, and there was no delegation waiting to negotiate. No emperor appeared. No peace treaty was offered. Then fires began spreading through the city. Buildings burned. Warehouses disappeared. Smoke filled the sky. The French soldiers watched as the city they had captured was consumed by flames. Napoleon had taken Moscow, but he had not won the war. And this was the moment when the campaign began to turn decisively against him. He waited for Alexander I to negotiate, but Alexander refused. Days passed, then weeks. Napoleon's army remained in Moscow while winter approached. The emperor finally faced a terrifying reality. He could not stay. He had to leave. In October 1812, Napoleon ordered the retreat. The army that marched out of Moscow was dramatically different from the army that had entered Russia months earlier. Thousands were wounded. Thousands were sick. Food was becoming scarce. Horses were dying. The men were exhausted, and now they had to travel hundreds of kilometers back west. But the Russians were waiting. The French attempted to move along a route that might provide better supplies. At Maloyaroslavets, Russian forces blocked the way. Napoleon was forced to retreat along the same devastated roads his army had previously used. There was little food left. Villages had already been stripped. Fields had been destroyed. The army was now marching through a landscape it had already consumed, and then came the cold. The winter of 1812. The Russian winter has become legendary, but the cold was not the only reason Napoleon lost his army. By the time winter arrived, the Grande Armée had already been devastated by disease, hunger, exhaustion, combat, and supply failures. Then the temperature dropped. Snow covered the roads. The wounded struggled to move. Horses collapsed. Men abandoned weapons simply because they were too exhausted to carry them. At night, soldiers gathered around tiny fires. Anything made of wood became valuable. Furniture, fences, doors, buildings. Anything that could burn was used to survive another night. Some soldiers simply collapsed beside the road, and once they stopped moving, they often never stood again. The army was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. The Russians close in. The Russian army continued to pursue Napoleon's retreating forces. The French were attacked whenever they became vulnerable. Every battle cost more men. Every delay increased the danger, and the retreating army became increasingly disorganized. Thousands of stragglers separated from their units. Discipline weakened. Food became even harder to find. Some soldiers searched abandoned settlements for anything edible. Others followed the main column, simply because staying with the army offered the best chance of survival. The once mighty Grande Armée was becoming a desperate procession of exhausted men. But the worst moment was still ahead: the Berezina River. In November, Napoleon's survivors reached the Berezina River. The river stood between them and safety, but the bridges were gone. Russian forces were closing in. The French army was trapped. Napoleon's engineers desperately began constructing temporary bridges. Soldiers rushed toward the crossings. Thousands tried to escape. Panic spread. Men fell into the freezing water. Wagons became stuck. The bridges shook beneath the enormous weight of people, horses, and equipment. Russian attacks continued. For a moment, it seemed possible that the entire remaining French army could be destroyed beside the river. But the engineers kept working. French forces fought desperately to protect the crossing. Eventually, enough of the army escaped to continue west. The French had survived the Berezina, but survival was not the same as victory. The Grande Armée had been reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Napoleon abandons the retreat. Napoleon now faced another crisis. News had arrived from France. His empire was vulnerable. Political enemies were watching. Napoleon needed to return home and raise another army. So he left Russia. The emperor traveled west. The soldiers remained behind. The men who had crossed the Niemen beside him were now left to complete the retreat without their commander. And when the survivors finally reached friendly territory, the army that had once seemed unstoppable was barely recognizable. Hundreds of thousands had been killed, wounded, captured, or lost. Napoleon had lost more than soldiers. He had lost the military power that had made his empire possible. The collapse of the empire. The consequences were enormous. Russia did not stop at its borders. The Russian army pushed west. Prussia turned against Napoleon. Austria joined the coalition. Britain continued the war. Napoleon tried to rebuild. And remarkably, he managed to raise another army. But something had changed. His enemies now knew he could be defeated. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was broken. The disaster in Russia had created the opportunity Europe had been waiting for. Within 2 years, Napoleon would be defeated. His empire would collapse, and the man who had once dominated Europe would be forced to abdicate. So what really destroyed Napoleon's army? Was it the Russian winter? Not by itself. The disaster was caused by a chain of failures. The enormous distances stretched the supply system. The Russian retreat denied Napoleon the decisive battle he wanted. The scorched-earth strategy deprived his soldiers of food. Disease weakened the troops. Thousands of horses died. Borodino caused devastating casualties. Moscow failed to produce a peace agreement. The retreat forced the army across devastated territory. And then, the winter made an already desperate situation almost impossible. Russia had turned its greatest weakness, its enormous size, into its greatest weapon. Napoleon could defeat an army, but he could not defeat distance. He could capture a city, but he could not force an emperor to surrender. And he could march east, but eventually he would have to march back. The invasion of Russia was not simply a military defeat. It was a lesson in the limits of military power. Napoleon entered Russia believing that a decisive battle would determine the war, but the Russians refused to give him that battle on his terms. They retreated. They sacrificed territory. They destroyed supplies, and they allowed time itself to weaken the invader. The battlefield was no longer a single location. The battlefield was the entire Russian landscape, every road, every river, every abandoned village, every kilometer of distance, and eventually, every degree of cold. Napoleon's army did not disappear in one dramatic moment. It disappeared gradually, man by man, horse by horse, unit by unit, day after day. In June 1812, hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossed the Niemen River. They marched into Russia with confidence. They believed they were part of an army that could not be defeated. Months later, a small number of survivors stumbled back west through the snow. Behind them were abandoned weapons, dead horses, destroyed wagons, and thousands upon thousands of graves. The invasion had begun as Napoleon's attempt to force Russia to surrender. Instead, it became the beginning of the end of his empire. Russia did not destroy Napoleon's army in one spectacular battle. It did something far more devastating. It made the army march deeper and deeper into a land that seemed to have no end, until the army could march no more.